You have heard this word your whole life, usually aimed at a woman, usually meant to end the conversation. Hysterical. We use it as an insult, a way of saying a woman has lost control, gone irrational, stopped making sense. But for most of recorded history, it was not an insult. It was a diagnosis, a real one, written in real medical books by the most respected doctors of their day. And the word gives away exactly what they thought was wrong with her. Hysteria comes from the Greek word hystera. It means womb. The disease was literally the womb disease. And the single qualification you needed to be at risk of it was simple. You had to be a woman. This is the story of a diagnosis that lasted, in one form or another, for roughly 2,000 years. It runs from ancient doctors who believed the womb was a living animal that wandered the body, to women locked in silent rooms and forbidden to read, to surgeons who cut healthy organs out of healthy women to calm their nerves, all the way to an official medical manual that still listed it as a real condition within living memory. And underneath every chapter sits one idea, held by the cleverest men in medicine for 20 centuries. The idea that a woman's body is not quite trustworthy, that it is in itself a kind of illness, one she was simply born with and would have to be managed for the rest of her life. That is the lie. Let me show you how long it held. To understand how a single word became a weapon, we have to go back about 24 centuries, to the place where medicine began writing things down. In ancient Greece, doctors had a theory about the womb, and it was a strange one. They believed it was not a fixed organ at all, but something almost alive, a restless creature inside the body that could detach and wander, drifting up toward the chest or the throat, pressing on other organs, and causing havoc wherever it went. The philosopher Plato described it as an animal seized with longing, roaming the body when it went too long without a child. The Greek physician Hippocrates and the texts that carried his name built a whole framework of female illness around it. The details are stranger than fiction. Doctors taught that a womb starved of moisture would climb upward in search of it, and that the lump a frightened or grieving woman sometimes feels rising in her throat, something almost everyone has felt, was the actual organ pressing up against her windpipe. They even named it. For centuries, that sensation was called the globus hystericus, the hysterical ball, a perfectly normal feeling, reclassified as the womb on the move. And one of the oldest medical documents we have, an Egyptian papyrus written thousands of years before any of this, already lists remedies for a womb that has wandered out of place, which means the idea is, quite literally, almost as old as writing itself. If a woman felt anxious, breathless, dizzy, sad, irritable, or simply unwell, the explanation was ready. Her womb had moved. And the older Egyptian medical papyri, written even earlier, prescribed treatments that follow the same logic, fumigating the body with sweet scents to lure the wandering womb back down into place, or foul ones to drive it away from where it had strayed. But notice the cure they kept landing on. Again and again across these ancient texts, the recommended treatment for a wandering, lonely womb was marriage, sex, pregnancy. The medical advice, conveniently, was for the woman to do precisely what her society already wanted her to do anyway. And here is the move that would echo for the next 2,000 years. Because the womb could supposedly travel anywhere and disturb anything, almost any symptom a woman had could be blamed on it. Too emotional, or too cold. Too interested in sex, or not interested enough. tired, restless, talkative, silent. There was no complaint that could not be filed under the womb. Doctors had built a diagnosis that explained everything, which meant it explained nothing, and which could never be proven wrong. For 2,000 years, the womb was the suspect in almost every case. And then medicine got better tools, and the suspect started to pay for it. But the road there ran through somewhere darker. Because in the medieval and early modern centuries, the line between a medical diagnosis and a religious accusation got thin and dangerous. The same cluster of symptoms, fits, trances, strange speech, a body that seemed to move on its own, could be read by a doctor as the wound and by a priest as the devil. A woman behaving in a way no one could explain might be sent to a physician in one town and to a witch trial in the next. The diagnosis and the death sentence were, for a frightening stretch of history, the same set of behaviors seen through two different lenses. Whichever lens you got depended largely on who was looking and how the year was going. The diagnosis never really died, it just changed costume. Through the medieval period and the Renaissance, it shifted shape, sometimes tangled up with witchcraft and possession, sometimes with melancholy. But by the 1700s and 1800s, hysteria had hardened into something with a very useful function. It had become the great catch-all label for any woman who was, for any reason, inconvenient. You can hear the leftovers of it in phrases people still half use today. When someone says a woman has the vapors, that is a fossil. The vapors were a genuine medical idea. Invisible fumes thought to rise from the womb and the gut, fog the brain, and bring on swooning, fainting, nervous spells that fashionable women were forever having. It is also why a lady of the period was rarely far from a vial of smelling salts. The sharp ammonia jolt was the standard tool for reviving a woman who had succumbed to her own anatomy. The same smelling salts, incidentally, that boxers and weightlifters still crack open under their noses today. A relic of the wandering womb, sitting in a gym bag. Think about who got the diagnosis. The woman who was unhappy in a marriage she could not leave. The woman who wanted more than the life she had been handed. The woman who was grieving, or angry, or exhausted, or simply too clever and too restless for the narrow room she had been placed in. A doctor could look at all of that and write down a single word, and that word turned a reasonable response to a difficult life into a malfunction of the body. It is a beautifully efficient trick. You do not have to listen to a woman's reasons if her reasons are a symptom. And the symptom list was a thing of genius because it was endless. Victorian physicians cataloged the signs of hysteria, and the catalog ran to dozens of entries, then hundreds. Nervousness, insomnia, fluid retention, shortness of breath, irritability, loss of appetite for food, loss of appetite for sex, too much appetite for sex, a tendency to cause trouble. By the late 1800s, some doctors were prepared to argue that a huge share of all women were either hysterical or on the verge of it. Think about what that means. If nearly every woman is a little bit sick simply by being a woman, then womanhood itself has been quietly defined as a medical condition, one that requires lifelong supervision by someone other than the woman. You did not have to do anything to qualify. You only had to be inconvenient and to be female, and a doctor could supply the rest. And the diagnosis had teeth. It was aimed with real precision at women who reached for more. When women began pushing for higher education, a Harvard physician published an influential book arguing, with the full authority of medical science, that serious study was physically dangerous to them, that a young woman who sent too much blood and energy to her brain would starve her reproductive organs, wreck her fertility, and quite possibly drive herself into nervous collapse. In other words, if you wanted to learn, the experts warned that learning would damage your womb. The threat was not metaphorical. It was dressed up as biology, and it was used for decades to keep classroom doors shut. So the trap closed from both sides. Be ambitious, and you were endangering your health. Be unhappy with the cage, and you were hysterical. And in a grim twist, for many women, the only socially acceptable way to register that something was wrong with their lives was to get sick, to faint, to take to bed, to become a patient. The collapse became the one form of protest a respectable woman was allowed. The system had made illness the only exit, and then diagnosed the women who took it. And the treatments matched the goal, which was rarely to make her happier. It was to make her quiet. The most famous of them was invented by a respected American physician named Silas Weir Mitchell, and he called it the rest cure. On paper, it sounds almost gentle. In practice, it was something closer to solitary confinement. A woman diagnosed with hysteria or nervous exhaustion would be put to bed for weeks. Total bed rest. She was often forbidden to read, to write, to sew, to feed herself, or to see her own family. She was fed rich food and massaged like an invalid, and left alone with her own mind and nothing to do inside it. The cure for a woman overwhelmed by a life with no outlet was to remove every last outlet she had. One of his patients was the writer Charlotte Perkins Gilman. The rest cure pushed her so close to a genuine breakdown that she later turned the experience into a short story about a woman confined to a room until she loses her grip on reality entirely. It is now read as a classic. At the time, it was a warning, and very few people in charge were listening. The instruction the doctor gave her has survived, and it is chilling in its plainness. He told her to live as domestic a life as possible, to have her child with her at all times, to lie down for an hour after every meal, and to have, in his words, but 2 hours of intellectual life a day, and as long as she lived, never to touch a pen, a brush, or a pencil again. He prescribed, to a working writer, the surgical removal of her work. She followed it for a while, came near to losing her mind, threw the advice out, and recovered by doing the exact opposite. She was one of the lucky ones because she could afford to leave. Many women could not. The writer Virginia Woolf endured versions of the same enforced rest, and the cold, managing doctors who imposed it turn up in her fiction as figures of quiet menace, men who mistake silencing a woman for healing her. But the rest cure, with its private nurses and its milk diet, was a luxury of the wealthy. It mattered enormously which kind of woman you were. A rich woman labeled hysterical was sent to bed or to a spa town to take the waters. A poor woman with the same label was sent somewhere with a lock on the door. The asylums of the 19th century filled with women committed for hysteria, for melancholy, for nervousness, sometimes for little more than defying a husband or a father who had the legal power to sign them in. Once inside, the diagnosis became a trap that justified itself. Any anger at being locked up was proof of the madness that had locked you up. Calm was improvement. Protest was relapse. There was, by design, no version of your behavior that could win you the door. Now pause on that logic for a second, because it did not stay in the 1800s. The core assumption of the rest cure was this: a woman is reporting distress, and the correct response is not to believe her account of her own life, but to treat the distress itself as the problem and shut it down. Hold that thought. You are going to see it again, much closer to home. Back to the period. Because rest, as grim as it was, sat at the gentle end of the menu. Some doctors decided the trouble was not in a woman's mind at all. It was in her body. And a body, unlike a mind, can be operated on. This is where the story gets genuinely hard to hear. In London, in the 1860s, a prominent and well-regarded surgeon named Isaac Baker Brown reached a conclusion. He decided that hysteria, along with epilepsy and a list of other conditions, was caused by a woman's own physical excitement, and that the solution was surgical. He began performing clitoridectomies, the surgical removal of the clitoris, as a treatment. He published a book promoting it as a cure for insanity, epilepsy, and hysteria in women. He believed he was at the cutting edge of medicine. For once, the establishment recoiled. In 1867, his colleagues at the Obstetrical Society of London put him on trial in front of a packed, jeering hall and voted to expel him by 194 votes to 38. One opponent put the objection about as plainly as it could be put. "We have scarcely more right," he said, "to remove a woman's clitoris than we have to remove a man's organs." It would be a relief to say that ended it. It did not. Baker Brown was disgraced in London, but the underlying idea that a woman's reproductive anatomy was the source of her madness and could be cut away to fix her mind did not die with his career. It crossed the ocean and went bigger. In the United States, a surgeon from Georgia named Robert Batty introduced an operation in 1872 that he called normal ovariotomy. Read that word carefully. Normal. He was not removing diseased ovaries. He was removing perfectly healthy ones, on purpose, from women who had nothing physically wrong with their reproductive organs at all. The theory was that forcing a young woman into early menopause by cutting out her healthy ovaries would calm her nervous system and cure her. And the list of things this was supposed to treat is almost unbelievable. Doctors removed healthy ovaries to treat insomnia, neuralgia, back pain, convulsions, mania, something they actually called ovarian insanity, and, of course, hysteria. It is the exact same trick as the wandering womb 2,000 years later with a scalpel attached. First, you decide a single female organ is responsible for nearly everything that can go wrong with a woman. Then, instead of luring it back into place with perfume, you simply remove it. The operation spread through the 1870s. It was performed on thousands of women by men who were celebrated for it in an era when surgery still killed a meaningful share of the patients who underwent it. The surgeon himself understood the scale of what he was doing, and he was proud of it. In his own writing, he described entering, in his words, the hidden recesses of the female organism and snatching from its appointed seat a healthy organ. That is not the language of a man cautiously treating an illness. That is the language of conquest. And the stakes were so high and the public so uneasy that, according to one account, a mob was reportedly waiting to take justice into its own hands if his first operation went wrong. It did not go wrong. The patient survived, The procedure was hailed, and the knife moved on to the next woman whose nerves needed settling. And the silence around it was total. These were not back-alley butchers. They were respected professionals, publishing in respected journals, applauded by their peers. Nobody was charged. Nobody was stopped. It was, in the language of the day, simply good medicine. Meanwhile, across the channel in Paris, hysteria was becoming something else entirely, a show. A famous French neurologist named Jean-Martin Charcot ran a vast hospital full of women diagnosed as hysterics, and he turned their suffering into public theater. He held lectures where he would present these women to an audience, put them into hypnotic states, and display their dramatic fits and contortions as a kind of live demonstration. He photographed them in their distress and published the images. Women in genuine crisis became case studies, performers, and props. Sitting in that audience, taking notes, was a young doctor named Sigmund Freud. The modern field of psychology grew, in part, directly out of these rooms, out of men studying women labeled hysterical and deciding what their bodies and minds really meant. The patients themselves were almost never asked. Some of them became famous in the way a specimen becomes famous. One young woman, known to history mainly by a single first name, was photographed over and over in the throes of her so-called attacks, her poses catalogued and published in a lavish volume, as if her suffering were a reference chart. Historians now suspect that the women in that hospital learned, consciously or not, to perform the exact symptoms their celebrated doctor expected to see. That the disease on display was partly a thing the audience had taught them to produce. And yet, buried in all of this, something almost accidentally decent happened. Freud took the strange idea that you might cure a hysterical woman not by cutting her or confining her, but by sitting down and letting her talk, and actually listening to what she said. It was the beginning of the talking cure. After 2,000 years, the radical new treatment was, finally, to ask the woman what was wrong, and believe that the answer might be worth hearing. And here's the detail almost nobody mentions. The phrase, the talking cure, was not coined by Freud. It was coined by a patient. One of the most famous cases in the whole history of psychology, the woman recorded as Anna O, was really a young woman named Bertha Pappenheim, and it was she who described what was helping her. She called it the talking cure, and, more rarely, chimney sweeping. For once, the woman labeled hysterical was the one who named the thing that worked. And she did not stop there. She walked out of that role entirely and became one of the most formidable social reformers of her generation. The textbook hysteric grew up to be the expert. Nobody had expected that to be possible, because the entire system was built on the assumption that it was not. Now, you may have heard a very different, much more fun version of this story. The one where Victorian doctors supposedly treated hysteria by stimulating women to orgasm, and where the electric vibrator was invented as a labor-saving device so physicians wouldn't tire their hands. It is a fantastic story. It has been in books, a play, and a Hollywood film. It is also, according to the historians who went back and actually checked the original sources, not true. When two researchers examined every source behind that claim, they found no evidence that doctors used these devices to bring women to orgasm as a treatment. The vibrating machines of the era were real, but they were marketed for all sorts of ailments, used on the back, the head, the limbs, and were largely penetrative gynecological tools, not instruments of secret pleasure. The reality was simply less titillating and much darker. The treatment for a woman in distress was not a hidden orgasm. It was isolation, a locked room, and, for the unluckiest, the operating table. So how does a diagnosis like this finally die? Slowly. Embarrassingly slowly. As psychology matured and as women gained education, the vote, and the ability to be heard, hysteria as a formal diagnosis began to crumble. The wandering womb was quietly dropped. The surgeries fell out of favor. You would assume the whole thing was buried somewhere back in the gaslit 19th century. It was not. Hysteria survived as an official psychiatric diagnosis under the name hysterical neurosis in the Standard American Manual of Mental Disorders as late as 1968. It was only removed in the next edition, published in 1980. Sit with that date. Not the Middle Ages, not the Victorian era. 1980. There are people reading this who were alive and adults when a woman could still, in principle, be formally diagnosed with a condition whose name means, and has always meant, that the problem is the fact that she has a womb. The word finally left the manual. The logic did not leave the room, because here is where the 2,000 years actually lead. Hysteria, the word, is gone. The reflex behind it is not. The reflex is the one you saw in the rest cure. A woman reports that something is wrong with her body, and the first instinct is to suspect that she is exaggerating, that she is anxious, that it is emotional, that it is, in some softer modern phrasing, all in her head. It now has a name. People call it medical gaslighting, and the research behind the frustration is real. Studies repeatedly find that women's pain is taken less seriously than men's, that women wait longer to be treated, that their symptoms are more likely to be written off as psychological. Consider endometriosis, a genuinely agonizing condition affecting enormous numbers of women, where the time from first symptoms to a correct diagnosis is routinely measured not in months, but in years, often the better part of a decade, much of it spent being told the pain is normal or imagined. And it goes well beyond one condition. Researchers have described what some call the Yentl effect, the finding that a woman having a heart attack is more likely to be sent home, her crushing chest pain read as anxiety or stress, because the textbook picture of a heart attack was built around men. Whole categories of illness that mostly strike women, chronic pain conditions, autoimmune diseases, have been historically understudied and underfunded, partly because women were for a long time simply not included in the research at all. The wandering womb is gone, but the deep assumption that a woman in distress is probably overreacting, that the trouble is most likely in her head and not her body, never fully left the building. It just stopped writing its name on the chart. You can still hear the old theory hiding inside ordinary modern questions. When a woman is upset, and the first response is to ask whether she is on her period or to call her hormonal, that is the wandering womb wearing a hoodie. The claim is identical to the one Plato made, that her body, specifically her reproductive system, is overriding her mind and making her unreliable. The vocabulary modernized, the accusation did not. The only thing that has genuinely changed is that women now have somewhere to compare notes. Search the word for medical dismissal online, and you will find millions of people, mostly women, swapping near identical stories of being told it was anxiety, until it turned out to be a tumor, an autoimmune disease, a heart attack. For the first time in 2,000 years, the patients can hear each other. And it turns out they were never as alone or as imagined as they were told. For 2,000 years, when a woman said something was wrong, the most educated answer available was that the wrong thing was her. The diagnosis is finally gone from the books, but it left one fossil behind, and you have been holding it this whole time. The word hysterical. You began this knowing it as an insult. Now you know it is an artifact, roughly 24 centuries old, and that it has only ever meant one thing: a woman whose own body has overruled her mind. It is the wandering womb, still drifting through ordinary conversation, still landing on women who are simply angry, or grieving, or right. But one thing in this story finally changed, and it is the gentlest thing in it. For almost all of those 2,000 years, a woman told she was hysterical had no one to turn to but the man who had told her. She heard it alone. Now, for the first time, the women on the other end of that word can find each other. They can compare notes. They can discover how often the diagnosis was wrong and how rarely the body was actually lying. They were never as unreliable as they were told. They were only, for 20 centuries, never asked.